Last week I began my sermon saying, gosh, that was a long reading, wasn't it? And today I find myself beginning my sermon the same way, and I have a spoiler warning for you. In all their wisdom, those who have put together our lectionary have given us another full chapter of John next week. So steel yourselves and get ready for another long gospel reading next week. This gospel passage from John starts sort of in the middle of the story. There we have Jesus and his disciples walking along, and they come across a blind man. The disciples' response to this man is, well, I'll say it's interesting. I'm not sure that it's the best response. They decide that this is a great occasion for them to ask Jesus this deep and rather odd, at least to our ears, question. They turn to Jesus, their teacher, and they say, "Teach us something, teacher. Tell us, this man has been born blind. Who caused this to happen? Why was he born blind? Was it because his parents sinned, or was it because of his sin?" Now, we may find their question both strange and offensive and also illogical. One is left to wonder how someone could be born blind because of the sins that they committed, since they haven't even been alive yet to do anything wrong. But this idea that somehow being born with a disability or suffering in other ways, that somehow it was caused directly by the sin of that person or their family, was actually a common belief at the time. Many Jewish people would have thought in this way, although as we see in the discussion that follows, not everyone, of course, agreed with that doctrine. But it was alive and well, this idea that if someone is suffering, basically they somehow must have caused that suffering themselves through their actions. Now, we may find, standing 2,000 years later, we may find their question illogical and strange and offensive, but the truth is that we continue to think in this same way today. Oftentimes, even in the modern world, when we see someone suffering, we humans often want to blame them for their suffering. And indeed, we even have terms for this. You've probably heard of the problem of blaming the victim before, right? You've probably encountered this kind of thinking among people. If you haven't, I'm glad for you, but unfortunately, it's quite common. The disciples' question sounds illogical and offensive and cruel, and this logic of blaming the victim is likewise actually quite illogical and cruel. But if you go online, and especially if you go on to a forum where people can freely respond, you'll see this all the time. Someone might post online about being worried that they can't pay their rent this month because they don't get paid enough at their job. And some people might respond with words of comfort or condolence, or maybe even a link to a job offer somewhere else. Many people will say, well, just get a better job. It's your own fault if you don't have that money. Somehow thinking that everyone in the world can be a Fortune 500 CEO or something. That somehow we can have a society without people like teachers or sanitation workers or others who do critical work and are often not paid well for it. The idea that is, if you're not making enough money, it's somehow due to you. You need to hustle harder. You need to learn more. You need to somehow magically have a better job. Consider how often people who are sick or have medical problems are blamed for their own illnesses. Many people who have lung cancer, others simply assume that they smoked cigarettes and that's it. That's the end of the discussion. It's their own fault. Ignoring the fact that actually plenty of people get lung cancer without ever smoking. And even many people who smoke, well, we know that smoking is deeply addictive. Most of us are addicted to at least something. And yet we use that person's behavior as an excuse to blame them for their own illness. Consider how often, indeed, when we find out that someone is in an abusive relationship, we often blame them for staying in that relationship. Saying that if you've been abused once, you should have already left, and if you haven't, well then, that abuse is somehow your fault. Ignoring the fact that oftentimes people can be trapped in those kinds of relationships for all kinds of reasons. We often do what the disciples, I think, were doing, wanting to blame someone for their suffering. That we do this really isn't up for debate. It happens all the time. The question that caught my attention this week, as I considered our gospel passage, and as I considered our contemporary society and how often we want to blame the victim, the question that stuck with me is not whether we do this, but why do we do this? If, when we step back, we can see how illogical and how cruel and how offensive it is to blame people across the board for their own suffering, why do we do it? And it seems clear to me that the answer isn't that hard to discern, even if it's uncomfortable to admit. If we blame people for their own suffering, it allows us to shift blame away from other causes. And that's often convenient for people in power who are actually often truly accountable for many of these problems, right? If poverty is the poor's fault, that means that the rich and the powerful don't need to take any accountability whatsoever for income inequality. If sick people are ultimately responsible for their own illnesses, then that means we don't need to have any difficult conversations about providing universal medical coverage to everyone, right? If the abused cause their own abuse, then we don't need to have any difficult conversations about aggression in our society or the ways that our understanding of masculinity often causes violent and destructive behavior, especially, but not only, but especially by men towards women. If we blame the victims, if we blame those who suffer for their own suffering, we don't need to consider the accountability of any of these other groups. And I think that's what blaming the victim is all about. It may be illogical and cruel, but it has a purpose. It does work in our society, shifting blame from those who often actually have the resources to do something about the problem towards those who often do not. But of course, we don't only blame the victim, do we? What's also interesting in the disciples' question, right? Who sinned to cause this man's blindness, the man or his children? Notice that the disciples are also essentially holding God accountable for this problem. The idea being that someone sinned and God presumably is punishing the sin by making this man blind. We like to blame the victim, and we also often like to blame God. When something bad happens, we might say, oh, well, I don't know, it must be part of God's will. It must be part of God's plan. This, again, allows us to shift accountability from often the people who are actually causing the problem. If a war occurs, we could say, well, somehow this war serves God's purposes. It might be better for us to stop and consider which human beings caused this war and what their purposes were. Shifting blame on God, I think, often serves the same function as blaming the victim. We shift accountability away from some people and onto someone else with the purpose of making sure that actually nothing is done to stop the problem, that nothing is done to end that suffering. If something is God's fault, we human beings, presumably, have no accountability. Okay, so these disciples are doing, I think, some victim blaming, some God blaming. The question that we then next have, of course, is, well, how does God respond to this? How does Jesus, their teacher, respond to this? And of course, for us as Christians, those are two ways of asking the same question. Jesus initially offers this verbal response, which is itself somewhat perplexing. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him, which is strange. What exactly does that mean? Is God somehow still then accountable? It's unclear. But notice the next thing that Jesus says. He immediately moves from playing the blame game to talking about action. We must work the works of light. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus doesn't seem particularly interested in figuring out who to blame. Rather, he's concerned with doing something about this man's suffering. And indeed, the very next thing he does is he makes mud with his saliva, right? He spreads it on the man's eyes, and we would normally expect that this would have, no efficacy, but in this particular case, the man is healed. His blindness is ended. And I think we need to understand that it's this act of healing that is Jesus' real response to the question. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus responded by, let's heal him. Let's make it so that he's no longer blind. That's what concerns Jesus. That's what concerns God incarnate. Rather than the blame game, let's heal what is broken in our world. As Jesus says in another place later in the Gospel of John, quote, I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. Jesus isn't particularly interested in assigning blame here. And the truth is, as I've already suggested, that when we try to blame people, especially when we want to blame the victim, we blame those who suffer for their suffering, or we blame God for something, it's often not that we're trying to really identify the cause of a problem. We're not really trying to figure out how to solve the problem. Rather, we're blaming the weak so that the strong don't need to take any action to fix the problem. God, however, is constantly urging us to instead take action to fix the problem. Now, this doesn't mean that blame, or I might prefer to say accountability, this doesn't mean that accountability is not important, that it's never necessary to demand accountability from human beings for their actions. Indeed, if we want to fix a lot of the problems in our world, one of the first things we'll have to do is ensure that we human beings are accountable for what we have done and what we are doing. But if we notice how often blame is used not to really draw out genuine accountability, but is instead used to shift responsibility onto those who often bear little or no responsibility, then we come to see that blaming people is often not about discovering accountability. It's actually about trying to generate non-accountability. And that should hold our attention, give us awareness of what the blame game is often really about. God's refusal to blame the poor, to blame the sick, to blame the abused is clear. And it comes into its clearest light, its clearest focus, of course, on the cross, right? Ultimately, this is the teaching of the church. As strange and as odd as it sounds when we say it out loud, this is what we say. God comes into the world as a human being, preaching truth and acting in love and solidarity. That's Jesus' life in a nutshell. Jesus feeds the hungry. Jesus heals the sick. Jesus restores what has been damaged and broken. Jesus teaches the truth. A group of powerful humans, political and religious leaders, respond to all of this healing and teaching and loving and feeding by arresting, torturing, and executing this person. He's not convenient to their goals. In other words, incarnate as Jesus, God is a poor and abused person, quite literally, if mysteriously. God is absolutely and truly a victim on the cross, killed by powerful humans. God is not interested in blaming the victim. God is interested in living with, healing, restoring, and empowering those who are often victimized. And that's just what God does on the cross. Apart from all the teaching that God actually says about go and care for those in need. In God's own action in the world, incarnate as Jesus, God shows how we ought to respond to this game of blaming the victim. Now, we're in the season of Lent, which you can tell with all the purple regalia we have. And the season of Lent, of course, is a penitential season, a season for us to especially focus on holding ourselves accountable, right? We need to understand the ways that we've sinned, the ways that we've done things that are harmful to others, harmful to ourselves, and that interrupt our relationship with God. First of all, sin has to be understood as simply not doing God's will, not feeding the hungry, not healing the sick, not restoring what is broken, not speaking the truth. The gospel today is just part of God's teaching that suffering of the world is not somehow caused by God. Indeed, God is present trying to reverse it. Rather, the suffering, much suffering in the world, is caused by our human failure, our human refusal to actually do God's will. All that loving and solidarity that Jesus is always talking about. Attempts to blame God or to blame the victims of society is an attempt by humans to dodge our accountability. And if this was true 2,000 years ago, I think it's even truer today. Not all problems in the world, of course, are caused by humans. The brokenness of our world extends beyond the human realm. We know that there are plenty of natural evils. There are plenty of ways that our world causes pain and suffering. But a lot of the suffering we experience is either caused by human activity or is something that's caused by the world that we could ameliorate, we could stop, we could help with if we chose to. And we often don't. Rates of cancer, if you look at a map, rates of cancer go up considerably near things like coal-fired power plants, oil refineries, and chemical factories. That's a fact. It's totally uncontroversial. We know that this happens. And we know that the people who live near power plants, refineries, and factories tend overwhelmingly to be people with low income and are often people of color. That's not an accident. We're causing cancer to these people. Society sort of benefits from economic activity, but people pay a price. Domestic violence has many causes, but it's certainly exacerbated by these models of masculine culture that are harmful. This idea of what it means to be macho, masculine, to be in control, ideas of patriarchy may not be the only cause of intimate partner violence, but they certainly contribute to it. And if we want to understand why there are so many poor people in the world, we ought to consider that companies, big companies and small companies, spend a lot of time and energy figuring out how to pay their workers as little as possible. It's one of the best ways to increase your profit margin. So if we want to understand why there are so many sick people, why there are so many abused people, why there are so many poor people, the causes are complex. And yet we know a lot of this is caused by what we can only call sinful action in our world. Blaming the victim, blaming the God, blaming the incarnate victim is society's ways of dodging that accountability. Dodging that accountability. What the disciples' question and what Jesus' response gives to us today, I think, is a choice. A choice. Jesus is constantly trying to give us choices and hoping that we'll make the right choice. Will we spend our energy trying to blame the victim, to try to blame the least fortunate for their misfortune? Or, like the incarnate God, will we instead focus our energy on seeking genuine accountability and seeking to heal what is wounded and to repair what is broken? My friends, I hope that we will consider carefully and choose wisely. Amen.